You're listening to Finn Voices on Healthcare Now Radio, where we highlight and amplify the voices at the forefront of health innovation that improves people's lives. Join us for an inside look at the change makers driving conversation and answering the most important questions in healthcare today. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us on Finn Voices, a show where we amplify the voices of healthcare innovators. I am your host, Carrie Young, coming to you from the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. I'm a partner at Finn Partners, where I get to work with leaders across the health ecosystem. Today, I am so pleased to introduce my guest, Marna Canterbury, Senior Director of Community Health and Engagement at Health Partners. In her role, Marna provides organizational leadership and community partnerships, needs assessment, and key community health initiatives, including Power Up, a long-term community-wide initiative focused on the prevention of childhood obesity. Super Shelf, a statewide effort to transform food shelves to promote health. And Make It Okay, Health Partners' community campaign to reduce the stigma of mental illness and to provide community support and resources for mental illnesses. And that is the topic of our conversation today. If you are looking for Marna, she's on LinkedIn, Marna Melrose Canterbury. And welcome, Marna, and thank you so much for joining us.
Carrie, thanks for the invitation. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
I am as well. So I'm real interested to start at the beginning. I'd love to hear what led you to community health and ultimately working at Health Partners.
Well, that is a great place to start. I am really glad to be here on behalf of both Health Partners and Make It Okay. I've been back at Health Partners for more than 10 years, having spent some time here early in my career as well. But really throughout my career, I've had a focus on health. I'm trained as a registered dietitian originally, and then went on and pursued a public health degree. But I think the point is it leads me to two things, right? Community and health. And at Health Partners, community has been part of how we approach our work, right? It's part of our mission. We provide excellent care and insurance coverage, but we also know that 80% of health happens outside of what we can do in a medical environment. And so we really lean into how do we partner with the community? How do we develop initiatives and programs to make a difference in overall health? And that's my passion. So it's been a privilege.
Well, I'd love to hear more about your areas of responsibility and what do you find most fulfilling about working in community health?
Yeah. So when it comes to community health, that can be any topic, right, that is facing our community. We assess the needs, we look for those needs. And so my responsibilities is really to oversee and provide leadership for a broad array of topics. You mentioned some of them at the beginning, but really when it comes to mental health, that has been both a long-term interest, but it also is a rapidly rising community health priority. Maybe we've all felt that in the past few years, but even prior to the last few years, the awareness about mental health is health. Mental health care is health care, right? So I have the privilege of helping guide some of that work, and mostly the privilege of working with community partners who really bring the work to life through the work we do together.
So to set the stage for our listeners, can you provide some context around the topic of mental illness? So I'm talking about how prevalent it is, what are the most common conditions, and so on.
Of course. You know, I just mentioned when we do an assessment of the community and the health needs of the community, it's a formal process. Mental health and well-being is clearly at the top. So we know that from our full service area, which extends throughout the state of Minnesota and beyond. And we could hear from the community the concerns and see the data that reflects it, whether you're looking at suicide rates or treatment rates, it's clear. But the prevalence of mental health conditions or mental illnesses is much greater than most people think. So 1 in 5 adults in a year will experience a mental health condition of some kind or a mental illness. But more than half of adults in their lifetime will be diagnosed with some kind of mental health condition or illness. But how I really think about it, 100% of us know, love, work with, go to school with a person who lives with a mental illness, if it's not ourselves. But one of the interesting things is those facts are not well known. There's a perception that somehow this is rare, somehow this is a rare occurrence, and a stigmatized experience is what we get as a result.
Yeah, still today, right? And I think about diseases like, I think about physical diseases like diabetes, even type 2 diabetes and heart disease. And for some reason, they seem more acceptable maybe than mental illness. What's behind that? I think you're going to say stigma, I think, but help us understand what's behind the stigma of mental illness.
I love your comparison to physical illnesses. Sometimes that's a way that people understand those statistics I just rattled off. So let me do an example. So I talked about 1 in 5 people will be diagnosed in a year, right, with a mental illness. 1 in 10 is the number for diabetes. And yet with diabetes, we speak with much more pragmatism, much more grace, usually much more care and concern, and have supportive language and programs to do that. There's a lot of reasons how mental illness and this topic have become stigmatized. Few of them are really, there's less education about mental health, isn't there? From early school on, much less education. There is also less research into what happens in the brain and the body than there has been dedicated towards important physical illnesses like cancer and other really important concerns. Sometimes I'll hear people say, oh, it's because mental illnesses are invisible and we can't see them, so somehow they're mysterious. Well, lots of our physical conditions are also invisible. Hypertension, right? So that's a myth that folks have. There's just an overall lack of understanding that the brain is actually connected to the body. And so with that, we have the ability to do that comparison that you talked about. The problem is, in most cultures, including ours, whether it's the media or whether it's historical or sometimes community and cultural beliefs, mental illness is almost always portrayed negatively. There's very few examples where it's portrayed positively. So there's this narrative running, right? That mental illness is a character flaw, a moral failure, that people with a mental illness are violent. And then we use pretty freely, often as a culture, language like crazy and psycho. So I think my point is you can see how all these things layer on top of each other to create silence and shame and stigma. And actually, we have a really good opportunity to break that down with the simple comparison you gave at the beginning. This is a health condition. Let's treat it, talk about it, and care for it in that way.
Yeah, and subtle. I mean, the way that we talk about mental illness and the negativity around that is subtle, right? And it's almost not even, you don't even know you're doing it because it's become woven into, it's become colloquial kind of. So yeah, wow, I hadn't thought of it that way at all. I'm going to tell you, I was first drawn to the Make It Okay campaign when I saw a friend share it on LinkedIn, and she said, I became an advocate. And I'm like, okay, I need to know what that's about because that's cool. That's something I might want to be a part of. So I was intrigued by the topic, family history of mental health issues, right? Full disclosure there. But I was so pleased to see an organization talking about it in a way that felt approachable and it felt safe. And and so I want to hear more about what was behind the genesis of the campaign and why is it an important topic for health partners?
Yeah, that approachable nature, that I call it the matter-of-fact tone about this is intentional. So if we can speak about this without hushed voices, right? We don't whisper the word cancer anymore, and we don't need to whisper eating disorder or bipolar depression either. But it started with that realization. Health Partners has a large hospital that also provides excellent behavioral health care. And as we were exploring, and this is 10 years ago, we were exploring how to provide better care. And in that process, we heard very clearly from patients, from the community, from family, that we had an opportunity to have a less stigmatized experience, that there was stigma in healthcare right inside our own organization. So Make It Okay partnered with a number of community leaders and NAMI of Minnesota to say, let's tackle this issue. Who would have thought 10 years later we would still be focusing on stigma, but our data indicates we need to. That piece about making it approachable and safe, as you described it, is really at the heart of it. And it started that way. It started with, hey, mental illnesses are health conditions. We started internally. We grew partners and grew partners. It now has a national reach. I would love to hear how people hear about it like you did. And our focus is really to mobilize and empower others to have this information and to be able to share it in their community. It's so important because when we care about mental health and mental illness, which we do deeply at Health Partners, we need to start with stopping the silence. That isn't going to get us anywhere in terms of getting people the care, right, and the help they need and deserve.
Yeah, I think about, you said 10 years of progress. So it's amazing that we still need to be talking about it, but I think we will be 10 years from now, possibly. But it also seems like a lot has changed with the awareness and the acceptance of mental health, mental illness in the last 10 years. And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share some of the changes, some of the progress that you've seen over time.
Yeah, most definitely. You know, our headline here is that the stigma has changed and improved. It has. We have made progress and there's still work to be done. But let me tell you a little bit about what's behind that. We utilize and partner with our research institute at Health Partners. We're fortunate enough to have like really high quality researchers who help us answer questions just like the one you're posing. So since 2017, we've been fielding a community survey to ask the questions about what are your attitudes around mental health and illness? How do you feel about it? How do you think about it? We ask those questions, same questions over time. And here's some of the findings we've had. First of all, we have seen, especially leading up to 2019, some decreases in stigmatized attitudes. Like we can measure it in the survey, that people were less likely to say that people with mental illness weren't someone they felt comfortable helping, for example. We also had seen a reduction in the belief that people with mental illness were weak, and that was the factor that caused their mental illness, right? So we saw some progress, and we're super glad about that. We redid the survey in 2021, and we all know what was going on in 2021. Big, huge changes in how people were living and engaging and working, and more conversation, definitely more conversation about mental health and illness. What we found is some things did get better. Here's one. We saw that fewer people saw stigma in their communities. So when I asked, do you see it in your communities? Fewer people answered. And 57% still said they saw a significant amount of stigma. So work to be done, but it was less. The other piece that we see that are really haven't improved really over time is that 1 in 3 people still tell us that they would not tell a friend if they had been diagnosed with a mental illness. So that stigma even that people have about their own experiences, right? You talked about isolation and things at the beginning. That is a big feeder of that. Again, there's work to be done. We see some movements. My last comment on that is in the data as well as I think we've all observed it. There's more conversation happening, isn't there, about mental health and illness? Absolutely. I'm not always convinced that the conversations, however, are more informed. And so there is a learning need, right? We can talk about it, but people haven't had the opportunity to learn much about mental health and illnesses. And so that's a big opportunity to inform those conversations.
Yeah, the leader of our health practice at Finn likes to say that communication is part of the care continuum. And so I hear what you're talking about. I'm like, yes, you're living that through this campaign, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
If you are just tuning in, you're listening to Finn Voices on Healthcare Now Radio. I'm Carrie Young, and today we are speaking with Marna Canterbury. Senior Director of Community Engagement at Health Partners. So what about the impact of COVID? We all know, well, by now, most of us should know that not everyone was impacted equally, right? There are health disparities that surfaced during COVID that have been around since forever, but they're finally being talked about. Is that true for mental illness as well as physical illness?
Oh, it is very true. You know, the impacts of COVID, right? Aren't we all still unpacking a lot of this? When it comes to mental health, a few trends that we're seeing, I'll start with youth. That our youth, in both surveys and observations, we can see that this period of social isolation and the other impacts of COVID, that now we're looking at kids who have higher rates of anxiety and depression. And we have concerns as well about suicide rates in all age groups, really ticking up. We also see that there's an increase in overall diagnoses of especially anxiety and depression. And people might think of that as a concern, which of course it is. The flip side of that is we're talking about diagnosis of anxiety and depression. And so for someone to get diagnosed also means hopefully they're on a treatment path to help get, again, that care and support they deserve. And so a rising rate of diagnoses isn't always a negative. It does mean that some barrier has been broken down and they've gotten to the care system, right? The other pieces we've seen since COVID is with telehealth. We've seen people be able to access resources differently. It's not for everyone, however, and we do get concerned that certain folks get left behind. We also know, and this was definitely true, as you said, before COVID, and more true now, that communities of color have been disproportionately negatively affected. And families with fewer financial resources or those who live in poverty. There was this number that stood out in my head during COVID when we were looking at data, and for people who were food insecure during COVID, so that means they weren't able to reliably feed themselves or their families, there was a 250% increase in anxiety and depression. The data was from the Centers for Disease Control. And I have paused at that so many times to say, golly, there are so many things that impact mental health. So during the COVID period, some families, some people, some groups took harder economic hits and other kinds of challenges. And that had to have had an effect on the mental health and well-being of those families, right? And that was just one number that I think is an indication that really did happen.
Let me play that back to make sure I understood that right. So this is CDC data. Families experiencing food insecurity were 250 times percent. Okay,
yeah.
more likely to experience mental health issues?
Correct. It's specifically anxiety and depression.
Okay.
Yeah. So that link, that isn't one you can ignore, right? That is a huge link. So those social factors do impact mental health. We know that from the earliest learners, right? Through economic impacts like COVID. And that is something we have to continue to be aware of, to be sure that services and resources and things like Make It Okay are reaching to our neighbors who are struggling the most for whatever reason.
Well, and that aligns with what you said in the open, where 80% of health happens outside of the health system, right? Where food insecurity is a part of that conversation. Yeah. Wow. That I'm blown away. I had never heard that data point before. So let's talk about a call to action. So what can listeners do if they suspect or know a friend or a loved one who is experiencing mental illness, and maybe they're not ready to talk about it? It still seems like a sensitive topic. Some folks might not be comfortable with that conversation. What advice do you give people?
Of all the places on our website that get the most traffic, you just hit on that question. It's called What to Say and What Not to Say. But let me just introduce it with silence is the not right response. We don't want to not say something. There's so much, even with caring, concerned persons, people are really afraid of saying the wrong thing. So two things. One, say something and say it with love and care and concern. And if people don't know how to start the conversation, I often encourage people to say, how would I approach this if I was concerned about the person's physical health? Okay, I'm observing some things, more social isolation or depression or whatever you're observing, and say, golly, if they were showing signs of heart disease or anything, something that looked wrong with their physical health, you wouldn't stay silent, right? And you'd say something like, hey, I've just noticed some changes in you that worry me, and that, I care about you, and I wanted to be sure you knew I'm here for you. Is that something you want to talk about? Opening the door. I was at a roundtable around youth mental health, but just a few days ago. And we had a teenager there who was asked this question: what should someone say? And she said, well, I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing, one of the other panelists had said. And she said, well, I sat and waited for someone to say something to me for a really long time. So say something, because otherwise, I don't know that you care, or I'm not brave enough to raise this issue. I don't think that's just with youth. I think that's with all of us. The conversation from there are some things really not to say. And they are, like we were talking about earlier, maybe we've just fallen into cultural patterns around stigmatized language, but things that minimize the person's experience, like, oh, just try harder, or, buck up, or, oh, I've felt that way, or that kind of language isn't language we'd use around a physical illness, to go back to your example. We'd say things like, hey, do you want to talk about it? I'm here for you. Can I drive you to an appointment? Watch your kids? Here in Minnesota, we make each other's hot dishes. They're called casseroles everywhere else, folks, but they're called hot dishes here. And that doesn't routinely happen for people who, for example, have a mental illness hospitalization. We hear that from our care teams all the time. So it's that gentle approach that we would say, hey, something's wrong. It happens to be with someone's mental health, not necessarily their physical health. How can I respond that would be very similar? We know how to do this. We do know how to do this. We do.
We do. You're right. You're right. I never made the connection to never made the connection to bringing. I've had friends with cancer, and what do? You make them food. That's a thing, right? So and the way you're describing it takes some of the subjectivity out of it too. I'm observing this. Here's what I've noticed. And it makes it less, I don't know, it feels safer, maybe it wouldn't put the person, make them more uncomfortable than they might otherwise be. Yeah. So, wow, good example. What's ahead for Health Partners and Make It Okay? What are your priorities for this year?
It's been an exciting 10 years, right? We actually just celebrated 10 years. We had a panel discussion and a whole real look at where do we head now. And a lot of the pieces we've talked about looking to be sure that we're connecting with our most vulnerable communities in a way that makes sense. Prioritizing those partnerships and relationships to make sure this is a big tent and that everyone has the opportunity to reduce stigma. Again, I'll repeat, in a way that makes sense to that community. We also are going to continue to expand our resources around self-care. So mental illnesses and mental health are right next to each other. And whether a person has a diagnosis of mental illness or not, we all benefit from better mental well-being. And so to really destigmatize that conversation as well, because the more we talk about our own mental health or illness, the more we talk about these things, and it comes out of the shadows, right? And being honest and transparent about that and helping people do that. We also have a new initiative particularly around substance use disorder. Substance use disorder is tied right in there with mental health, and often people have both a mental health and a substance use diagnosis. We have started a new series of education that focuses on substance use disorder and the stigma there. Very related, right, to what happens with mental health, but different, and in some ways even more troubling. So we're really rolling that out with partners throughout the country, actually. So we're excited to see more, but basically we're going to keep partnering. We're going to keep partnering and sharing the word. So we hope that folks can join us, find out, and become a partner, or you said earlier, an ambassador for this work.
Love it. I love it. So we talked a little bit about the website. Let's give folks some resources. So do you want to share your website, your Facebook page? Where can they look if they want to learn more?
Absolutely. Make It Okay is found at makeitokay.org. Super easy to find. And when you get there, you will find a link to Facebook if you want to go there, or we are on Facebook as Make It Okay. Our colors are green and white, so you'll know you're in the right place if you see that. The other piece that's really important is that the website has so many resources that folks can do everything from take a pledge, a simple pledge to say, hey, I'm with you. I'm going to do my best to stop stigma. You can take a virtual online training with one of our facilitators for free. Just sign up right there. We run them every month virtually. We have folks from all across the country. We just did one today. It was great. We had 50 people from all over engaging with this.
Okay, I love that. I did go on the website, and full disclosure, I took the online quiz, and even I have a little bit of work to do, it turns out. So
we all do. You're right.
I learned something.
The bias around this, the stigma around this, is something we've all been living in a culture that does. So we all have work to do. The place that we see that individuals are often most challenged is that stigma we hold for ourselves, right? Can I really disclose this? And how do I learn to be brave to disclose my own challenges or that of someone you love?
And we're going to leave it there. Marna, Canterbury, thank you so much for joining us. To our listeners, thank you for listening to Finn Voices, a show where we amplify the voices of healthcare innovators. I'm Carrie Young with Finn Partners, and we will see you next time.
Finn Voices is brought to you by Finn Partners, a global marketing and communications agency working across industries and services. Whether inside our walls or on the front lines of health transformation, we stand together to create meaningful and measurable impact on the world around us. Learn more at finnpartners.com and follow us on Twitter @FinnPartners.